Good. We're good to go. So, welcome. Today, my guests are Ruth Stearns-Mandel and David Mandel of the Safe and Together Institute. I wanted to talk to them not just because they are dear friends of mine and Canton residents, but because of the important work that they're doing around the world on the issue of domestic violence. So, welcome, guys. Good to see you.
You, Eleni. It's great to be with you.
It's good to see you, even
Yeah.
virtually.
I know. Something's better than nothing, right? And I
Yeah.
just want to remind everybody, if they have questions, they're more than welcome to put those in the comments, and we will address those as we get them. So I just would love for you guys to start out talking a little bit about the work that you do and the work that you've basically done across a lifetime on this issue and sort of, where you are now with it.
Well, David's done the lifetime part, so I'm going to let
You've
David.
done Lifetime in a different way.
I've done
Actually,
lifetime in a different way.
that she'll explain.
Yes, yes.
I've been doing work around issues of violence against women since college. So now this means, unfortunately, going back, over 30 years, something like that. And, my original desire was focused on working with men, and I think that's part of the big message I want to give people is, I think a lot of times people think about this work as being work that women need to do, and it's really work that men need to do.
Yeah.
And I think, so for me, it was about educating men around rape, sexual assault, and particularly focus on violence against women in that aspect. And then I started doing work with men who were arrested. Connecticut had one of the first mandatory arrests with probable cause laws going back to 1986. And, I don't know if a lot of people know that anymore, but it was right in Torrington where Tracy Thurman sued the city of Torrington, the police department, because she wasn't being treated fairly, and she won, and it changed everything in Connecticut. So I got involved with the very first group of men who were arrested and sent to classes. So I just ran groups for men. Fast forward, did work with DCF for years, and out of the work with families, and particularly around children, domestic violence, created the Safe and Together model and the Safe and Together Institute, which is now taken off and being used globally. And just recently, I can talk about what it is, but we are in Australia, Canada, the UK, Asia, but we were just on a call with somebody who says in Alice Springs, Australia, which is, Northern Territory, they're doing Safe and Together training. And they said, well, wait a second, that's not even it. It goes further out to the bush. Mm-hmm. And so for me, the idea that our work is going to really some of the furthest corners of the world is just amazing.
Yeah. And reaching so many people who so sincerely need it. So that's wonderful to hear.
Yeah, and the really simple way for people to understand it is really systems. We're a systems intervention. A lot of times people think about the really necessary needs of direct service like shelter and advocates everywhere, which are so critical in the ground services. So to not duplicate what was already being done and what was so needed was we targeted child welfare systems, professionals, professional training, law enforcement, and courts, and basically said, you need to do a better job partnering with survivors, and you need to see domestic violence perpetration not as something that happens between adults, but something that when somebody perpetrates domestic violence, it's also harms the function of the family and the kids directly. I think a lot of times people miss that. And so we say you need to intervene with perpetrators as parents, and so they're very clear, simple messages that obviously have resonated because it's been picked up across the United States, across North America, United Kingdom, and Australia, now New Zealand. So just, I guess it resonates with the people.
Yeah, I'll say something about that. The language really does resonate with people because what a lot of victims and survivors experience when they enter into these systems is a lot of siloed practice around domestic violence and child maltreatment. And being a person who experienced both of those things, I know that those things are not actually separate issues.
Right.
They're issues that impact a whole family. And so, for example, if you were to look at why the Safe and Together model has really taken off, most of the population experiences coercive control or domestic violence in some way, shape, or form. In the United States, we've classically thought of domestic violence as being hitting, kicking, strangulation, physical acts of harm. But in many countries now, coercive control, which are the non-physical aspects of violence, are really being understood as being a huge driver for harm in children and harm for women in particular,
Mhm.
which is the taking of freedoms away from a human being and the destruction of their own liberties and their own ability to move in the world and their own sense of self and their
Right.
sense of safety. So, classically non-physical forms of coercion, of threat, have not been considered as being domestic violence, but a great case, which is an unfortunate case, is actually the Jennifer Dulos case, where she warned the family court that her life was in danger and that he had threatened her, but because there was no physical evidence of that harm, they did not listen to her. And that occurs way too often with way too many survivors and victims of coercive control and domestic abuse. And we should not be waiting until the point where people are physically harmed or in danger of their lives, particularly children, for us to be intervening in domestic violence and coercive control. And so a lot of victim survivors really recognize the language and the positioning of Safe and Together, even when they're working in systems that
Right.
aren't doing a good job, that are not really looking at that reality, and that don't have a history of being domestic violence informed. And the reality is that a lot of people that work in those systems want people to be safe. They want lives to be supported and nurtured, and they want children to be safe. And so reforming those systems is actually a fundamental aspect of our work.
Right.
I just want to go a little further into what you describe as coercive control, because I think that that's a term that, while I'm familiar with it because of my many conversations with you guys, I don't think people are. And as you know, I was friends with Jennifer Dulos. Our children were often at the same schools. And I will tell you, I had no idea because we weren't that sort of friends. But it's interesting that since I have been raising more awareness on this topic, how many women have come out and said, I was a victim, this is what happened. Even in my own family, my aunt came forward. I had no idea that she'd been in a marriage like that for 20 years. So if you can just talk about the coercive control in terms of what it looks like when it isn't violence.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different actions that coercive control takes, but the fundamental intent of it is to control another person's ability to be free and move through the world. And that can be done in multiple ways. And so understanding when a person is fearful for their life and afraid and anxious and terrorized by another human being that's supposed to be their partner or their parent, or their sibling or a coworker, is really, really important. So it is marked by a removal of freedoms. It is marked by a fear for one's safety because threats have been leveled against that person. And do you want to expand some more on some of the more tangible behaviors?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is so important because when people think about domestic violence, the term can be challenging, think about, the hitting, the punching,
Right.
Kicking. But when you think about, it could include things like yelling and screaming, but it often includes setting rules. I think about things like cases I worked on, because I did a lot of direct service work for years. I worked with one family where with the man in the household, he took all the doors off the cabinets and off the rooms. I just want you to think, you're not going to get arrested for this. This is my own home. I'm doing this. This is never going to lead to an arrest. But if you just think about that kind of act, one is the attitude is you're not using these doors correctly. One of the statements was you leave the doors open. And as a parent, I can't tell you how many times in a day I close cabinet doors. So
Right.
like we're not talking about that, but there's sort of this idea that I'm going to take the cabinet doors off. I'm going to sort of, it's so hard, I think, sometimes to see it because it's a matter of degree,
Right.
behavior, because you could say, well, everybody has marital problems, or we have disagreements, or I don't like her friends. Well, she doesn't like my friends, or, all these different things. I think that's what makes it confusing for people sometimes, that it's, the language we use doesn't get to the detail and the behaviors. And that's some of what the model does, is really direct professionals particularly to think about, don't let it say he has a temper problem. Describe it, because as soon as you start describing the behaviors, what does that look like? Well, having a temper means, you know, I could say I get angry, but what it means, I go in the other room and I sit quietly for a while and I withdraw, and maybe I get upset too often, but I'm not hitting anybody, I'm not threatening anybody,
I'm not kicking in doors.
Right.
You know, I'm not terrorizing people.
You're not isolating from the family. You're not removing food as a punishment. You're not.
That's
I'm not driving fast with the kids in the car,
Yeah.
yelling and screaming at my partner. You know,
Yes.
so, you know, when you
Yeah.
start asking people to describe what does that look like,
Right.
you know, and this is, you know, we have we'll talk more, I'm sure, at some point about the ally guide, but one of the things Ruth, and it was Ruth's inspiration, and it was a really great piece of work on our website. We have an ally guide, which is really meant to help family and friends support somebody who's a victim survivor. And one of the things that ally guide does is help people name it and have those hard conversations. So it's not enough to say, well, he has a temper problem, or, you know, he'll be upset if I come home late, I gotta go. And you know this, your friend, this is kind of weird, or they used to be more outgoing. And, you know, and however you approach it, it's not until you kind of get at that sense of, wait a second, something doesn't feel right here. What does that look like? When you say he's going to be upset when you get home.
Or he's frequently texting or calling while she's with you because he needs to know where she is every second of the,
Right.
you know.
And I think a lot of times that person will be embarrassed and comfortable and say, well, he loves me so much and cares about me so much. But if that's your friend, you want to be thinking about whatever the belief she may be having, or even he may be having, what's the functional impact?
Right.
It's impeding their relationship with friends and family. It's making her from the function that may have lost a job because I don't want you working around men.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you think about that, going back to wrap this up, going back to the idea of taking doors off people's rooms, the idea that you can't have privacy. I can see everything you're doing.
I can control everything
I can
around
control
you.
you're doing. And we have, people become friends. Luke and Ryan Hart from the UK, and they, their dad murdered their mom and their sister.
Yep.
4 years ago, not that long ago, 5 years ago, and one of the things that was, you know, very important was there was no physical violence that he perpetrated against the kids or the mom before this. So some data suggests half of domestic violence homicides are not preceded by any physical violence.
And I can tell you of two more examples of that, even from my own life. I did a talk like this separately with Connecticut Against Gun Violence last week. And I knew a kid in high school and a kid in college. The kid in high school, he ended up getting killed and his mother was killed. There were no previous acts of violence that anybody knew about. And then in college, the dad killed the mom and almost killed the sister. Again, no previous acts of violence. And so, you know, there is this, I think, you know, for some cases, yes, you see that escalation and we know all about those, but then there's these other cases.
You know, Eleni, the problem is that we have focused on incidence-based practice.
Right.
Yes.
And we have looked at incidences of violence as being instrumental in informing us about danger and harm. When the reality is that that's not enough. And that's actually, it's a really poor misunderstanding of abuse and domestic violence. In order for us to have a true look at danger, lethality, potential for harm, and trauma, we have to look at the context and the history of a relationship or even past that relationship. Because a lot of domestic abusers have serial relationships where they've abused a partner and the partner has left, and maybe they had children with them and they continue to coercively control them via the family courts,
right,
via other social services, where they report that person as being a child abuser or whatever, and they've continued to try to harm that person through these patterns of behaviors.
Other means of control, right?
That's right. So
Yep.
in order for us to really truly have a sense of lethality, and this is why when Connecticut wanted to change the laws to include coercive control, it's really important that in order for people to establish coercive control, they cannot come from an evidence-based background. They have to learn how to look at perpetrators' patterns of behaviors of harm and control that are not physical. And as of now, I'm not sure that most of our institutions have that ability because they have not been trained in that and they don't see the need for that. And that's a fundamental and primary need that has to change in order for us to make women and children and domestic violence victims who are men more safe. We can't continue to look at incidence-based. We have to be a pattern-based look at all of these actions of harm.
Yeah, and I think that sort of leads us into, in terms of the systems, we've had some conversations around the officers that respond to this. And I know that you have the statistics at the ready of what it looks like. We know there are good police officers. I have a dear friend who, when she was going through a situation, he slipped her the number of Interval House, and thank God she got herself and her children out, because the officer said, if you stay here, he's going to kill you.
Yeah.
And that was a good situation, but there's also some that are not such great situations.
Yeah, unfortunately, the reality is that between 40 to 66, depending on the subset of officers that you look at, depending on their position, police officers have perpetrated domestic violence. And most of those officers, even if they have 1 or 2 or 3 arrests, are still on the force. And this is because of a few major loopholes. Recently, in talking to an ex-chief of police who drafted recommendations for the International Association of Chiefs of Police, he said to me, if we can't reform the police right now, then shame on us.
Wow.
There are needs to reform the police in not only their vetting, their training, and their retention of officers who have committed serious and violent crimes, including sexual assault and domestic violence and child abuse. Those violent crimes still remain on the force. And they do so because of internal investigations. They do so because of preferential treatment by prosecutors and by judges.
Mm-hmm.
They do so because of a code of silence. And they do so because they're actually incredibly dangerous perpetrators. And their victims, who are often police women who are married to policemen, and so the Police Women's Union has been on this issue,
Wow.
they are often left in these very dangerous positions where there is a perpetrator who has a gun and has tremendous amounts of power, knows where all the refuges are, has a co-located advocate in their precinct who it has ties to them. And so that person who's being victimized by that police officer doesn't feel safe going to the coalition, doesn't feel safe going to a refuge, doesn't feel safe reporting. And those officers that are involved in those violent criminal activities have admitted to, this is in research, self-admitted to abusing civilians at the rate between 75 and 82%.
And that's in the United States.
And that's in the United States. And that's a direct correlation to civil rights violations, to excessive force violations. And this is a known factor. The FBI has looked at this issue for over 25 years. There has been research about it, and there's a tremendous amount of literature, professional literature about this. But the conversation has not made a lot of headway. And
what do you attribute that to?
I attribute that to a certain amount of fear,
Mm-hmm.
of wanting to not have to engage that inside of police precincts, but also having to deal with police unions about qualified immunity, and also just the tight bonds that are created in a system where there's a high level of trauma, and
Mm-hmm.
people feel that they're protecting themselves from the outside world. But there are many police officers and many chiefs of police and many people in the FBI and law enforcement that already know that this is a necessary reform, and they have been working towards it for about 25 years.
And I do think that that's something that we sometimes forget, is the stress that police are under, the trauma that their job inherently brings into their own lives. That is something that certainly we want to make sure that they are receiving the mental health counseling, regardless of their situation, but as you said, there's a lot of room here. And especially, if you have the FBI having been looking at this for so long, but it is difficult to get to that, what's the next step to get this reformed?
Right. I think that the main thing to remember is that PTSD does not cause domestic violence.
Correct.
Mental illness does not cause domestic violence. Substance abuse does not cause domestic violence. They can correlate to a higher rate of domestic violence, but that doesn't mean that they're causal. There are plenty of people who have PTSD who do not beat and harm their family members or civilians. And this is true in the military as well. We've trained the military. the Ministry of Defense in the UK. So we know this. This is an operational readiness issue as well. You can't have operational readiness when you have families that are in trauma and you have people that are abusing their coworkers and abusing their family members as well. This impacts the whole system of law enforcement.
Absolutely.
You know, I think at this point in time, I think, yeah, sort of why isn't this dealt with sooner? I think another way to look at this is this moment is really ripe with the focus on police reform, on the focus on excessive use of force, to really dive deep, you know, into this issue right now. And it's complicated. You know, I've been around the work, you know, a long time to really be close up against the time when the police wouldn't respond. And this is one of those both and situations where the police are necessary.
Of course.
We need the ability to say that somebody who engages in a certain kind of behavior in their home it's a crime. And I think we don't want to lose that. And we don't want to lose the tight bonds that have been created between advocates and the courts and those sorts, because those advocates play a really critical role. At the same time, we'd be naive to say that the criminal justice response works for everybody the same way. Black women, brown women feel differently about calling the police. They're more afraid that something's going to happen. They're more likely to be arrested themselves, even as victims.
Yep.
So we need to address that. And we need to address, you know, whether it's an issue of culture, whether it's an issue of policy, whether it's an issue of training,
All of the above.
all the above. That the idea that the New York Times did a study, did research 2013. If anybody wants it, they can ask us for it. But they basically show that and I've seen more data from other places since then, that police officers are more likely to be fired or disciplined if they steal or they lie.
Wow.
Or they get, and this is really interesting, or they get into off-duty altercations, which is another form of violence.
Right.
So you have to stop and think without prejudging and going, okay, wait a second. There's something that doesn't make sense here, because we never want a police officer who committed drug offenses responding to a drug crime.
Yeah.
But we have over and over again, and Alex Roslin, who's going to be one of our interviewees on this series we're about to do in our podcast, he says, look, there's a 2 in 5 chance that the police officer responding to a domestic violence call is somebody who's perpetrated domestic violence themselves.
When you guys told me that number, I was absolutely floored.
And then people say to us, I've been on a couple of calls recently, New York State, and some of them are saying, and we really need to look at, they were saying, why so many domestic violence call-outs don't lead to charging. And I'm not saying that's the only factor. I mean, I really want to be clear.
Right.
These are complex cases, you know, they're difficult situations. But if we don't identify these as one of the factors we need to address, then we're putting our head in the sand. I think it's a disservice to law enforcement themselves not to talk about it. Right. It's a disservice to jurisdictions that are opening themselves to greater legal and economic liability.
Right.
We're paying for it in if we're doing repeat calls. You know, one of the things you hear over and over again if you've been in the field long enough is police officers hate going out over and over again to the same place. But what if the truth is the last officer that went out didn't handle it well because of their own personal attitudes and biases? So now you're a responding officer who wants to do the right thing, but it looks at this case and go, we've been here 3 times. Well, maybe the first 3 times the response wasn't great by law enforcement. So I think we're strong enough, we're courageous enough. I think we're smart enough to have people have these conversations and really do something about it at this point in time.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that, you know, interesting that you say, and we talk about, okay, not every case is different. And so you don't want to say like every officer that shows up.
No, it's not.
But it also, I think there's, especially with women, there's a lot of blaming that goes on that, well, she doesn't want to press charges or she doesn't want to, and I was only a criminal justice minor, 25 years ago, but I can remember so clearly reading all of that literature that was the second you get a restraining order, the percentage by which your life becomes more in danger, not less so.
Right.
So those are the things that, I think about a lot when we think about this. And I think especially in terms of, the Jennifer Dulos case taught a lot of women that I know. I mean, it was something that I already knew, but, there's no socioeconomic level at which this doesn't happen.
No, there isn't, and it happens in same-sex relationships. It happens across economic, groups. It happens. There are male victims in heterosexual relationships, absolutely. And again, this is one of those places where people, I think we're smart enough, we know enough to say, look, and the predominant case is going to be a male perpetrator against a female victim. When men are violent against female partners, they're more likely to cause injury, and their behavior is more likely to be tied to a pattern of personal control, which is if you're looking for entrapment, harm to kids, people losing their jobs, psychological impact, that we're smart enough to make those distinctions and not fall into traps where people say, well, men and women are just as violent, and it's just the same, and it's just not the reality based on the data that we're seeing. And we have to be able to respond to those more rare situations where men are victims, and that needs to be addressed.
And going back to what you were saying originally, Eleni, where the frustration with people not wanting to press charges, you know, Jennifer entered into a system that was fundamentally the family court system. And that's typically the trajectory that many wealthy or middle class, you know, people take that trajectory. They go into family court, they go into mediation. But the history of domestic violence and child protection is that people who are in poverty, people who are Black, people who are Indigenous, people who are marginalized, they go through the child protection systems. They go through the carceral systems. And those carceral systems were actually set up on a bed of white supremacy, which really took a lot of people and put them into jail, when what they could have done is there could have been interventions that were invested in, behavior change programs, which in the United States classically have been not that great, could have been invested in and made better. There are some great behavior change programs that we have seen where the recidivism rates are lower, much lower than they are in, you know, in the United States, where they just give you certificates of completion. So we could have invested in a lot of other things that didn't directly lead to incarceration, because the reality is that not all domestic violence perpetrators are the same. You have to do a perpetrator pattern-based approach and look at the context of the violence and the history of the violence in order to get a sense of lethality. And you have a lot of people who could do better and whose partners and children want them to do better. And the reality is that many perpetrators have legal custody of their children via the family court, whether they should or they shouldn't have that custody, whether that custody is dangerous or whether that custody is harmful. And so we haven't invested in creating solutions that work. We have deferred to incarceration, and that has primarily and fundamentally hurt families that are poor, families of color, Indigenous families, immigrant families. And so that is a reality that we do have to face, and we do have to talk about, and we have to try to change as well. Yeah.
So as we sort of end or come slowly to our end here, I want to talk more about your ally guide that you came up with. I did include it early on. I mean, we know that because of the pandemic, domestic violence numbers have gone way, way, way up. Yeah. And, you know, it's sad to me that because the kids weren't in school, it appeared that the child abuse numbers had gone down, but that's because you don't have the teachers, you know, reporting and seeing what's going on. So if you can talk a little bit more about the guide, because I do think that there are a lot of people who, after the fact, after they see their friend leave a spouse, or God forbid there's a tragedy, they think, what did I miss? Or how could I have helped? Or what could I have done? And so that's why I think that guide is just so critical. And I also think it's critical in terms of, you know, I have two daughters, one in college, one in high school. And I think that, you know, I can remember one of my daughters early on went out with a guy a couple times, and she's like, I think he's one of those controlling guys. And I was so proud of her, because at the age that she was, I don't think I would have noticed. I don't think I would have thought of it in those terms. So
what I could say is, you know, what we're going to talk about right now, you can get it at our website, safeittogether.institute.com. You know, and also, you know, I think it's also available on our virtual academy, which is academy.safeittogether.institute.com.
And we can put some of these links in
there. That would be really good. And also the podcast you can put up as well.
Yeah. Yes.
But the ally guide is free, and it's parallel to a Choose to Change guide, which is actually for people who are violent, people who choose violence. And so the ally guide is and it's Ruth's inspiration.
Yeah,
And
I'll
can you
tell you.
talk
I'll
about
tell you
it?
how it came about. So I was raised in a cult,
Right,
and
Minor detail.
I was isolated on 111
Right.
acres with very violent people. We did have social services, but we were homeschooled. When we lived in California, we had a little bit more contact with social workers because we were receiving CHIP and other services. But in reality, they were really good at hiding the high levels of abuse, including high levels of physical and sexual abuse that were happening within the compound of their community. So when I took a look at the things that would have helped me, I knew that my best resources were actually friends and family. If I could co-opt them to help them with my safety and get them to understand how I was not safe, then a lot of times they could create a certain amount of buffer. Now, in my reality, that didn't happen. But later on, as I experienced coercive control in relationships, I disclosed that I was in a really difficult relationship because I didn't know how to use the word abusive. I wasn't experiencing any physical abuse in those relationships, but I was just experiencing a certain level of coercive control that kind of runs through a lot of behaviors that we see in popular culture and in our culture. And so I thought, well, with the absence of services, not being able to access services, not being able to have, not wanting to enter into a situation where I'm fully in the social services network, in the domestic violence, having them look at me under a microscope, look at my parenting under a microscope, and I want my partner to get help or I want my family to get help, then I knew that it was friends and family that were the best or the worst allies. Now, unfortunately, the statistics is that when people disclose to their friends and family, generally it's not actually a positive experience. That's the statistic. And so I was like, how can we make this a better, more useful, more safe experience for victims and survivors of domestic violence, child abuse, or sexual assault? And so I came up with using a friends and family guide to teach people the behaviors and the words and the actions of being an ally to somebody who's living in abuse. Because oftentimes we don't know what to do when we are faced with a loved one who's experiencing abuse, but who doesn't want to leave the relationship, because the only advice that we've been told to give is to leave, which is not always viable advice, to be honest with you. And sometimes
and decades earlier, I will tell you, like when my aunt came forward, decades earlier, it was don't tell anybody because they won't believe you. Not even, and this was women telling other, I mean, it was like, no, they didn't receive help. So when a woman came to them and said, this is what's going on, they said, well, just stay.
Everybody does that.
That's just marriage.
Yeah. And so actually in the guide, Eleni, there is one that says, don't say, you're lucky you have a man that comes home every night and puts food on the table. Because that is victim blaming. And that's just saying, live with the abuse.
Right.
It's lucky to have food on your table. So in the guide, it really does break down, how do people tell you that they're being abused without saying the word abuse?
Right.
That's a thing. That's a real thing. And then how is it that you ally with victims of domestic violence? What are the words you use? What are the actions you can take? What are the safety considerations? And it's not meant to be a replacement for services. It's to help friends and family keep that container of safety with their family member and make safety planning and make contingency plans and help that person through that process of understanding what's happening to them so that they don't blame themselves and so they don't get blamed for the violence that somebody else is choosing to perpetrate on them.
Right. Well, I thank you so much. Next month, as you know, it is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Interval House, that does so much great work locally. They're doing a lot of different things. They do have a Jennifer Farber-Doulos Memorial event. It's going to be a walk to end domestic violence, and that's a virtual event that they're doing. They also do their Brunch with Champions. Also, Connecticut against domestic violence. We'll put some of their resources in the comments as well. We want to make sure that people have the resources they need, because you just never know who's watching that could take something away from this. I know that it always surprises me when I go for my annual gynecology appointment and they say, do you feel safe in your home, in your relationship? And now, you know, my daughters hear the same thing. And I always think when I'm sitting there and I see the flyer on the back of the door and the phone numbers that are, you know, have been pulled off for Interval House or other, you know, domestic violence organizations, it really is in all our communities. And so, you know, you can't wish it away, unfortunately.
No, you can. And you know, there's so much more. That's so amazing they do that. And there's so much more ground to do. You know, wouldn't it be nice if people ask, you know, do you smoke? How are you sleeping? Are you
Right.
drinking? And do you have a temper issue?
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be great if all medical and annual physical asked that question, and it was something that really helped identify the dangers that might be there, and get help to somebody before
Right. It escalates.
escalates or it gets worse, and intervenes earlier. And I think there's so much good work out there, and there's so much more to do.
And I'm so grateful that you are doing the work you're doing, not just in the States, but everywhere. And I hope to see more good work, hopefully here in Connecticut as well. So
Be great.
Awesome,
Yeah,
Eleni.
Eleni,
thank you
yeah.
so much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank
And,
you so much for doing
and I
it.
know that this conversation is going to help a lot of people today. So thank you again. It's going to
Sure.
be up on YouTube and on our website as well. So thanks, guys.
Okay, thank you.
Bye, Eleni.
Bye-bye.
Take care.